Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Anytime someone tells you that you cannot be a Christian just by believing in Jesus, but they think that you need to do something else, and you can literally name anything, and I know in our world today we still add many things, but anytime somebody tells you that you cannot be in right relationship with God unless you do X, Y, and Z, they're most likely lying to you, and that is what the book of Galatians is really all about. Paul is trying to make the case that the only thing you need for right relationship with God is belief in Jesus Christ. Now, there's a lot of things that come after that, but Paul is working very hard to say the only thing you need to have right relationship with God is faith in his son, Jesus Christ. And when you have that, it does change your actions and you end up in right relationship with God. Today we're looking at Galatians 1-3. The book of Galatians is so interesting. It's only 6 chapters, so it's not hard to walk through the whole thing, but it is front and center to this conflict that's been happening. So we read James, we read Acts 15 and 16. These are all things we read recently. All of these things, including the book of Galatians, are happening at a very similar time, late 40s, early 50s AD, where the early church is having this significant problem. We've talked about it several times already. But originally, followers of Jesus, people who believed Jesus was the Son of God, they still believed they were Jews. They thought they were Jews who understood who the Messiah was and were worshiping the Messiah. Now that Gentiles are being introduced into the mix, the whole thing becomes more complicated because Jews did not interact with Gentiles. They thought Gentiles were just basically sinners. So now that these people who they had known, had learned, were basically just sinners, were coming into their midst and trying to worship together with them, there was all kinds of cultural issues that became really problematic. And so Paul is preaching to the Gentiles that all they need to do to come to right relationship with God, to have their sins forgiven, to live a life that honors the Lord, is to have faith in Jesus as their atoning sacrifice. And the Jews in Jerusalem and other Jewish areas, culturally speaking, they were saying that actually what you need to do is be circumcised and follow the law. So they were adding extra weight and more burden. So all this comes to a head at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. And the Jerusalem Council basically says, no, you don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian. You don't have to submit to the law to be a Christian. You basically have to do only a couple of things. And it's listed out. Let me find it here. In Acts 15, verse 29, abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what has been strangled and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. So the huge debate is, what do you have to do? The Jerusalem Council decides it's not much. It's this list of things. And yet people are still trying to mislead people. So Paul writes this letter to Galatians, to the church in Galatia, because this group of people known as the circumcision party are trying to redirect these early believers to following the law, and Paul is furious. In fact, a fun fact about Galatians is usually Paul has kind of these flowery, flowing, warm, kind introductions to his letters. He wrote most likely 13 letters in the New Testament, and usually he's very kind in his intros. But the intro to the Galatians is pretty short, and he gets right to the point, and it actually says, I am astonished, this is chapter 1, verse 6, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, basically the gospel of being circumcised and coming under the law. So the whole point of this book is that you are justified with God, you are justified to God just by faith in Jesus. You don't have to do other things. And so some of the book is explaining kind of what's been happening in the church, and some of it is explaining how we are saved and why we are saved. And that's more in the second part. We'll get to that later. But probably one of the most interesting things in chapters 1-3 is this fight that Paul gets into with Peter. Unfortunately, Paul seems to enjoy a good fight every now and again. Yesterday, In Acts 16, he was fighting with Barnabas to the point that he had to split up. Today, he's fighting with Peter. And what's happening is that the church has decided that Peter and John are primarily bringing the gospel to the Jews, and Paul and Barnabas are primarily bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. And Paul has done a lot, specifically in the area of Antioch, and Peter wants to come see what's going on. So when Peter comes to Antioch, Peter is very publicly enjoying the freedom that he has in Christ. He doesn't have to live under the law any longer because he's justified through Christ. And so he's eating with Gentiles, which means he's probably eating things that he hasn't eaten before. And he's hanging out with people who would be seen as sinners. And this is going along just fine. Peter is enjoying fellowship with people who are new Christians. Paul's also there, and you get the idea that this has been going on for some time. So then James sends a delegation of Jewish believers from Jerusalem, and as soon as they show up, Peter starts acting completely differently. Peter doesn't want to hang out with the Gentiles anymore because the people that he's known for a long time are now there, and he doesn't want to be seen hanging out with people who are understood to be, less than, good people. They're sinners. They might be believers, but they're not as good as the other believers. And so Paul gets in a fight with Peter and says, hey, you're being a hypocrite. You cannot be acting like this. I think it's kind of funny because I think it's really easy for us to fall into that same kind of category. I mean, how easy is it to identify with your people, kind of your core group? And when you're away from that core group, you really enjoy hanging out with people. And even in a spiritual sense, you might go on a mission trip or something. You might be, I don't know, even outside your church. Maybe you're hanging out at a different church. Maybe you're from a more conservative church. You have some friends from a more charismatic group. You like to hang out with them. You like to fellowship with them. But when your conservative friends are around, you're like, I can't be hanging out with those guys that speak in tongues. That's a little bit too weird. This happens. This happens in our church today, where we reject fellowship with people for whatever reason it might be. Maybe we have subtle doctrinal differences. Maybe we think we're better than somebody else. Maybe our friends think they're better than somebody else. Maybe there's some underground conflict that hasn't been resolved. But for whatever reason, we reject fellowship when before we have enjoyed it. And Paul would call us out. Paul would say, hey, stop being hypocrites. Like, we just don't have any room for hypocrites here. So Peter gets in trouble, and Paul's making the case that, like, hey, this is a whole new thing. We are justified by faith. We're not going to do all that nonsense. We're not going to fall under this circumcision party where people are saying that we have to do certain works to be justified. That's just not true. I also think that's why he wraps up chapter 3 with probably one of the more powerful thoughts in Galatians 1-3. If you look at Galatians 3, verse 27, for as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. And this is going to be a developing theme throughout the New Testament. Paul is saying, hey, we are followers of Christ first. So it doesn't matter if you're a Jew. It doesn't matter if you're a Greek. It doesn't matter if you're a slave. It doesn't matter if you're free. It doesn't matter if you're a man or if you're a woman. The thing that matters most about you is that you are a follower of Christ. And if you are a follower of Christ, then we have fellowship with each other because we are all heirs of God through Christ, his Son. And so Paul's going to work very hard to not allow these differences that were a huge problem. I mean, the early church, like when people would come together to worship, literally, and this is why Paul calls it out, literally, there would be a master who was a believer, and there would be a slave who was a believer, where normally one person had authority over another. Now they're worshiping together with no authority over each other. This was a whole new way. And so this is why Paul's saying, hey, when you are a follower of Christ, that's what matters. We can't allow these goofy other differences to split us apart, which is why he gets in a fight with Peter. It's why he tells Peter he can't be a hypocrite. And it's why he's telling the Galatian church, you are justified by faith alone. And it's also why he's telling the Jerusalem church, you are justified by faith alone. The law was just kind of this guideline that helped us to live a life that honors God, but ultimately God's plan has always been that we are saved by our faith. And Paul's going to develop this even further through chapters 4 through 6. So Galatians is a great book. As always, go read it for yourself. But I think that the thing to remember today is that you have right relationship with God when you believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He gave his life for your sin, and you're justified by his sacrifice and by his resurrection. And so when you do that, you have right relationship with God. Now, the second part of the book is going to show us that when you believe that, there are certain things you do because of that. And so just be encouraged by the fact that we are not strangers of God. We are heirs of God. We are sons of God. Paul's going to use that language tomorrow. So we'll be back again tomorrow. We'll finish out Galatians at that point. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.